They broke his body. They took his freedom. They destroyed everything he built. And he still won. That's not a movie. That's not fiction. That's what happens when a mind reaches a level most people never even know exists. A level where suffering stops being a threat and starts becoming fuel. You're about to meet 9 people who were put through hell. Not metaphorical hell. Real hell. The kind that kills ordinary men. And every single one of them came out the other side not just intact, but sharper, harder, and more dangerous than before. This isn't about motivation. Motivation fades. This is about something that doesn't fade. Something that gets stronger the more pressure you put on it. If you've been looking for the thing that separates winners from everyone else, you're about to find it. Stay with me all the way through. This one will change how you see your mind forever. And if inner steel is new to you, subscribe now. This channel exists for the person who refuses to quit. That's who this is for. Point 1. The man who survived the unsurvivable. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton sailed into the Antarctic with 27 men and a promise: we will cross the continent on foot. No one had ever done it. That was the point. They never got the chance to try. Their ship, the Endurance, got trapped in pack ice. For 10 months they were stuck. Frozen. Drifting. Then the ice crushed the ship like a tin can. It sank. They were left standing on a floating sheet of ice in the most remote and brutal ocean on Earth, with no radio signal reaching the outside world, no rescue coming, and no one who even knew exactly where they were. Most men would have shattered at that moment. Not from the cold, from the realization that it's over. That's the moment most people die inside even before they die physically. The moment the mind decides, there's no way out of this. Shackleton never let that thought take root. He made a decision, not out loud, not in a speech, but in the quiet of his own mind. He decided that his job was not to survive. His job was to get all 27 men home alive. Every decision he made from that point forward was filtered through that single, iron commitment. When men started to spiral into despair, he didn't give them pep talks. He gave them tasks. He gave them structure. He assigned watches, maintained routines, held mealtimes like they were sacred. Because he understood something most people never learn: the mind falls apart when it has nothing to anchor to. Give it a job, and it holds together. They camped on the ice for months. When the ice began to break, they launched 3 small lifeboats they'd saved from the Endurance. They sailed through the most treacherous waters on the planet, 60-foot waves, hurricane-force winds, temperatures that would kill an unprotected man in minutes. They sailed for 7 days and reached a tiny, barren island called Elephant Island. It was land. But it was also a dead end. No ships passed by. No one knew they were there. They were still going to die, just on solid ground instead of ice. Shackleton left the majority of his men there and took 5 of them on an 800-mile open ocean journey in a 22-foot lifeboat to find rescue. 800 miles. In winter. In the Drake Passage, the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the world. 17 days later, they reached South Georgia Island. But they landed on the wrong side, the uninhabited side. A mountain range separated them from the whaling station where help existed. No one had ever crossed those mountains. No map existed. They had no climbing equipment. Shackleton crossed the mountains anyway. He reached the station, organized a rescue, and went back for his men. Every single one of his 27 men came home alive. Here's what you need to take from this. Shackleton's mind never once accepted the framing that he was a victim of circumstances. He treated every obstacle as a problem to be solved, not a verdict on his fate. That's not optimism. Optimism is hoping things get better. What Shackleton had was something colder and harder than optimism. It was the absolute refusal to allow his mind to be conquered by what was happening around him. The ice could crush his ship. It could not crush the decision he'd made. That's the mind they couldn't break. Point 2. The woman who changed medicine by refusing to be ignored. Florence Nightingale arrived at the British military hospital in Scutari in 1854, and what she found there was a death factory. Soldiers who had survived the battlefield were dying in the hospital at a rate that horrified her. The wards were filthy. Sewage ran beneath the floors. The water was contaminated. Men were lying in their own waste. The mortality rate was 42%. Men weren't dying from their wounds. They were dying from the conditions in the place that was supposed to save them. She brought it to the attention of the military officials in charge. They told her to mind her place. She was a woman. She was not a doctor. She had no authority. The men in charge had decades of experience and titles and rank. And they looked at her, this woman who had defied her wealthy family to go into nursing, who had studied medicine on her own, who had crossed into a war zone, and they told her that her concerns were not their concern. A smaller person would have accepted that verdict. Nightingale did not. She couldn't force them to listen. So she did something smarter. She gathered data. Florence Nightingale became one of the first people in history to use statistical graphics to change policy. She invented what's now called the polar area diagram, a visual representation of data that showed undeniably that the soldiers were dying from preventable disease caused by unsanitary conditions, not from their wounds. She made the truth impossible to ignore. She sent it to politicians. She sent it to the press. She sent it to Queen Victoria herself. She didn't ask for permission anymore. She built a case so airtight, so visually clear, so statistically devastating that the people blocking her had nowhere left to hide. The reforms came. The sanitation improved. The mortality rate dropped from 42% to 2%. She didn't just save the men in that hospital. She changed how medicine was practiced across the entire world. The modern concept of hospital hygiene, of evidence-based healthcare, of using data to drive medical decisions, Florence Nightingale built the foundation for all of it. Think about what it took. She was working against systemic resistance, against cultural dismissal, against men with power who had every institutional reason to ignore her. She didn't fight them with anger. She didn't collapse into resentment. She found the tool they couldn't dismiss, irrefutable evidence, and she used it with surgical precision. The world said, "You don't belong here. Your voice doesn't matter." Her mind said, "Then I'll make the truth louder than my voice." That's the mind they couldn't break. Point 3. The prisoner who defeated his captors without lifting a finger. In 1965, Navy pilot James Stockdale was shot down over Vietnam. He ejected from his burning aircraft, broke his back on landing, and was immediately captured. He would spend the next 7.5 years as a prisoner of war in the Hanoi Hilton, one of the most brutal prison camps in the history of modern warfare. They tortured him. Repeatedly. They put him in leg irons. They kept him in isolation for years at a time. They tried to break him so they could use him for propaganda, to show the world that American soldiers were weak, that they would confess that the war was unjust. Stockdale never gave them what they wanted. But here's what makes his story more than just a tale of toughness. Stockdale didn't just survive, he led. While imprisoned, he was the senior-ranking officer. That meant every American POW in that camp was looking to him. He developed a code of conduct for the prisoners, a set of standards for how they would behave under torture, what they were allowed to give up, what they would never surrender. He understood that the fight wasn't physical. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in chains. The fight was psychological. His job was to ensure that his men's minds stayed intact, that even when their bodies were broken, their sense of dignity, of identity, of solidarity remained undefeated. He paid an enormous price for this. To prevent himself from being used in a propaganda film, he beat his own face with a stool until it was too disfigured to film. He understood that there are things more important than personal comfort. More important than avoiding pain. He was willing to damage himself to protect the integrity of his mission. Later in life, when asked about his survival, Stockdale made a distinction that has become famous. He said the people who didn't make it out were the optimists. The men who said, "We'll be out by Christmas. By Easter. By the end of the year." Each time their deadline passed and nothing changed, another piece of them broke. And eventually, he said, they died of a broken heart. Stockdale survived because he faced the brutal facts of his reality without flinching, while simultaneously maintaining absolute, unconditional faith that he would prevail in the end. Not by a specific date. Not through wishful thinking. Through endurance, discipline, and the refusal to let hope become a crutch that snapped under the weight of disappointment. He didn't hope his way out. He endured his way out. With his mind intact, his values uncompromised, and his men following him every step of the way. That's the mind they couldn't break. Point 4. The scientist who kept going when the world called him insane. In the 1840s, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered something that should have saved millions of lives. Instead, it nearly destroyed him. He was working in a Viennese maternity ward where women were dying at a catastrophic rate from childbed fever, a deadly infection that struck women shortly after giving birth. The mortality rate in his ward was nearly 10%. In a neighboring ward run by midwives, it was almost zero. Semmelweis studied the difference obsessively. He noticed that in his ward, the one staffed by doctors and medical students, the staff were going directly from performing autopsies on corpses to delivering babies, without washing their hands. He proposed a radical idea: have everyone wash their hands with a chlorinated solution before touching patients. The mortality rate in his ward dropped to 1% almost immediately. You would think the medical establishment would have celebrated this. They didn't. They attacked him. Because what Semmelweis was implying, without stating it directly, was that doctors were killing their patients. That the men with the degrees and the authority and the status were the carriers of death. The medical community of the 1840s could not accept that. It violated their self-image. It undermined their authority. And so they rejected him. His colleagues mocked him. His hospital refused to continue the protocol. His superior refused to let him publish his data. Semmelweis kept fighting. He wrote letters. He published his findings. He watched other physicians dismiss his evidence while their patients continued dying from a preventable infection, and the injustice of it consumed him. He was eventually committed to a mental asylum. He died there within 2 weeks, likely from the same type of infection he had spent his career trying to prevent. He died without vindication. But here's the brutal, important truth: he was right. Louis Pasteur's germ theory, which emerged years after Semmelweis's death, confirmed everything Semmelweis had discovered. His hand-washing protocol is now the most basic, foundational practice in all of medicine. Every time a surgeon scrubs in, they're honoring a man who died in a psychiatric ward because he saw the truth before the world was ready to accept it. Semmelweis teaches us something that the other stories don't quite reach: sometimes your mind won't break, but the world will break you anyway. And the question is whether you were right. Whether the thing you fought for was real. Whether the truth you carried was worth carrying. He never got to see his vindication. That didn't make him wrong. That didn't make his fight worthless. The truth doesn't need your approval to be true. And a man who dies defending the truth is not defeated. He lived in a mind they couldn't corrupt. Even if they broke the body that carried it. That's the mind they couldn't break. Point 5. The woman who sat down and changed a nation. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama after a long day of work as a seamstress. She sat in the first row of the colored section. When the white section filled up, the bus driver ordered her to give up her seat to a white passenger. She said no. That single word set off a chain of events that changed the United States of America. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, 381 days during which the black community of Montgomery refused to ride the buses, walked miles to work in the Alabama heat, organized carpools, endured arrests and bombings and intimidation, until the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. But here is what history often loses: Rosa Parks was not a spontaneous act of exhaustion, as the myth suggests. She was not simply tired from a long day. She was a trained activist. She had been studying civil rights organizing for years at the Highlander Folk School. She had been the secretary of the NAACP's Montgomery chapter. She had been waiting, consciously, for the right moment to refuse. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew what it would cost her. She was arrested. She lost her job. She received death threats. She was forced to leave Montgomery. Her husband had a nervous breakdown from the pressure. She spent years in financial difficulty. She didn't act on impulse. She acted on principle. And she held that principle steady through everything that followed. What very few people talk about is what her refusal required internally. It required her to sit in that bus seat, in that moment, in a state that had proven it would enforce humiliation with violence, and decide that her dignity was not up for negotiation. Not that day. Not under those terms. Not anymore. The mind that does that isn't reckless. It's not hot-headed or impulsive. It's a mind that has done the long, quiet work of deciding, before the moment arrives, who it is and what it will and will not accept. She didn't wake up that morning planning to change history. She woke up that morning as a person who had already decided what she stood for. History came to find her. That's the mind they couldn't break. Point 6. The musician who rebuilt himself from nothing. In 1959, John Coltrane was fired from Miles Davis's band. He was struggling with heroin addiction, showing up unreliable, disappearing mid-performance. Miles Davis, himself a man of towering artistic standards, told him he was done. Coltrane went home. He locked himself in a room with no phone, no visitors, no substances. He endured the cold turkey withdrawal from heroin and alcohol simultaneously. Anyone who knows what that process involves physically understands how brutal it is. It takes days. It involves your body in open revolt. There were moments he later described as feeling like death itself. He came out the other side clean. And then he picked up his saxophone and he played. What emerged from that room wasn't just sobriety. It was a love supreme, one of the most celebrated and transcendent jazz albums ever recorded. It was the sheets of sound technique that redefined what a saxophone could do. It was a body of work that changed the entire trajectory of jazz and influenced musicians across every genre for decades. Coltrane later described his withdrawal as a spiritual experience. Not in a soft or metaphorical way, but in the sense that something in him had fundamentally reorganized. He'd been stripped to the core. And what remained, when everything false had been burned away, was pure artistic obsession. He practiced 7, 8, 9 hours a day. Not because someone was watching. Not because someone told him to. Because the music was what he was, and now that nothing else was competing with it, it demanded everything he had. He had 6 years left to live. He died in 1967 at 40 years old. In those 6 years he produced more artistic innovation than most musicians produce in a full career. He wasn't racing against death. He almost certainly didn't know his time was short. He was simply a man who had removed every obstacle between himself and the thing that mattered most. What Coltrane teaches is this: the reset isn't the end. The moment everything falls apart, the career, the reputation, the relationships, that moment is not the verdict. It's the reveal. It shows you what's left when everything fake has been stripped away. And if what's left is real, if what's left is actual devotion to something worth devoting yourself to, then the collapse was the beginning, not the end. He didn't rebuild his life despite losing everything. He rebuilt it because he lost everything. That's the mind they couldn't break. Point 7. The man who ran through the impossible barrier. Before May 6, 1954, the medical establishment, the scientific community, and virtually everyone who studied human performance had agreed, a human being cannot run a mile in under 4 minutes. The body was not built for it. The heart would fail. The lungs would collapse. It was physiologically impossible. This was not casual opinion. These were professional assessments based on decades of data. Runner after runner had approached 4 minutes and failed. The barrier seemed to confirm what science had been saying. Roger Bannister was a 25-year-old medical student at Oxford. He had no coach. He trained in 45-minute bursts during his lunch break because his medical studies consumed the rest of his time. His training regimen, by modern standards, was modest. His resources were minimal. On a cold, windy day in Oxford, not ideal conditions by any stretch, Bannister ran the mile in 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds. The 4-minute barrier was broken. Here is the part that matters most. Within the next 12 months, 16 other runners broke the 4-minute mile. Within a few years, it had become a benchmark that elite milers were expected to reach. Today, the world record stands 3:43. The barrier wasn't physical. It was mental. The entire athletic world had accepted a belief that turned out to be completely false, and that belief had functioned as a ceiling. Bannister didn't just break a record. He broke a story that human beings had been telling themselves. And once he broke it, everyone else could see through the gap. But understand what breaking that barrier actually required. It required Bannister to train for years in service of something that everyone around him, including experts, including the data, said was impossible. It required him to enter that race and run not against the other competitors but against a number that represented the collective limit of human belief. It required him to hold in his mind, with complete conviction, something that had never been proven possible. That's not confidence. Confidence is when you believe you can do something because you've done similar things before. What Bannister had was something rarer: the ability to believe in a future that had no precedent. To train for an outcome that the evidence said could not happen. And then he made it happen. Your 4-minute mile is whatever you've been told you can't do. Whatever the experts have said is beyond your limits. Whatever the data in your own life, your failures, your setbacks, your history, seems to confirm is impossible. The mind they couldn't break is the mind that trains for the impossible anyway. Point 8. The man who turned 27 years in prison into a masterclass in power. Nelson Mandela walked into Robben Island prison in 1964 as a young revolutionary. He walked out in 1990 as the man who would become the first democratically elected president of South Africa. 27 years. Most of it spent in a small cell, doing hard labor in a limestone quarry, forbidden from seeing family, subjected to conditions designed to dehumanize and break his spirit. The apartheid government of South Africa was very clear about what they wanted. They wanted Mandela to either disappear from history or to emerge broken, a cautionary tale about what happened to those who challenged the system. Instead, he emerged as the most respected figure in the world. How? The quarry was one answer. While they forced him to break rocks, Mandela organized his fellow prisoners. He turned the prison into a school, debates, discussions, classes. He called it the University of Robben Island. Men went in with little education and came out with it. They studied, argued, grew. The quarry was supposed to destroy their sense of worth. Mandela turned it into a classroom. But there is something even more important than that. Mandela made a choice, and this choice is almost incomprehensible in its difficulty: to not become defined by hatred of his captors. He studied Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, so he could speak to the guards in their own tongue. He learned their culture. Not to betray his cause, but because he understood that the man who understands his opponent has power over the man who only hates his opponent. He maintained this position for 27 years. Not as a performance. As a practice. As a philosophy he had reasoned his way into and committed to with everything he had. When he finally walked out of prison, he didn't walk out angry. He walked out with a plan. Because a man who has spent 27 years developing his mind, refining his strategy, studying his opponents, and maintaining his values, that man is more dangerous walking out of a prison than most men are walking out of positions of power. They thought they were containing him. They were building him. That's the mind they couldn't break. Point 9. The psychologist who found meaning in the worst place on earth. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna when the Nazis came. He was taken to Auschwitz. Then to other camps. He lost his wife, his mother, his brother. He was subjected to conditions designed not just to kill but to strip human beings of every shred of identity, dignity, and purpose. He survived. And what he brought out of those camps was a discovery that has since helped millions of people navigate suffering. Frankl had been developing a theory before his imprisonment, that the primary human drive is not pleasure, as Freud believed, or power, as Adler believed, but meaning. That what human beings need most, in order to survive and thrive, is the sense that their existence matters. That what they do, what they suffer, connects to something larger than themselves. In the camps, he tested that theory in the most extreme possible laboratory. He observed that the prisoners who gave up, who allowed themselves to be completely stripped of any sense of meaning, died fastest. Not just from physical causes. They stopped eating. They stopped moving. They walked into the electric fences. The body quits when the mind decides there's nothing left to live for. But the prisoners who held on to something, a person they were surviving for, a task they believed only they could complete, a belief that their suffering had purpose, those prisoners showed a resilience that defied their physical circumstances. Frankl survived by deciding, consciously, that his suffering had meaning. He would observe. He would remember. He would carry the psychological data from the worst human experience imaginable so that when, if, he survived, he could help the rest of the world understand how to survive suffering of their own. He reframed his imprisonment as his life's work. Not as a tragedy that was happening to him. As a laboratory he was chosen to work in. He walked out of Auschwitz and wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote it in 9 days. It has since sold over 15 million copies. It is considered one of the most influential books of the 20th century. Think about what he did. He took the worst thing that can happen to a human being, systematic dehumanization, loss of everyone he loved, proximity to industrial-scale death, and he found within it the raw material for a contribution to humanity that would outlast him by generations. He didn't transcend his suffering by denying it. He transcended it by consuming it. By making it useful. By deciding that even this, even Auschwitz, could not make his life meaningless, because meaning is not given to you by circumstances. Meaning is chosen. Decided. Constructed. It is the last human freedom, the freedom to choose how you relate to what happens to you. The Nazis took everything from Viktor Frankl. They could not take that. That's the mind they couldn't break. Closing. Shackleton surrounded by ice with no ship and no rescue. Nightingale dismissed and told to be quiet. Stockdale in chains for 7.5 years. Semmelweis watching the world reject a truth that was killing people. Rosa Parks sitting still when everything around her said move. Coltrane stripped to nothing and rebuilding himself from the floor up. Bannister training for an outcome the entire scientific world called impossible. Mandela turning a prison cell into a throne room. Frankl finding meaning in Auschwitz. 9 people. 9 different kinds of hell. One thing in common. None of them let what was happening around them become what was happening inside them. That's the line. That's the whole thing. The external world can do what it wants. It can take your ship, your freedom, your reputation, your family, your health. There is one place it cannot reach, the space between stimulus and response. The space where you decide who you are and what you're going to do next. That space is yours. It has always been yours. The only question is whether you've claimed it. Most people haven't. Most people hand that space over to their circumstances, their moods, their failures, their fears, and they spend their lives being dragged around by forces they never chose to follow. You don't have to do that. The mind they couldn't break, you can build that mind. Not by avoiding hard things. By choosing hard things. By refusing to let suffering be wasted. By deciding before the storm arrives who you are. So that when it hits, there's nothing left for it to take. That's what Inner Steel is here for. Every week, every video, every story, it's all pointing at the same thing. The version of you that nothing can break. If you're not subscribed to Inner Steel yet, do it now. This community is built for the person who isn't done yet. The person who knows there's more inside them than they've shown the world. That's you? That's why you're still here. Go build something unbreakable. Inner Steel, the mind they couldn't break. Script copyright Inner Steel. All historical details should be verified before publishing.